Have you ever imagined standing in a courtroom looking across the aisle and seeing your own parents sitting there as the people suing you? Not strangers, not business partners, not friends who turned enemies, but the two people who brought you into this world, who were supposed to love you unconditionally, who promised to protect you no matter what. Well, I never imagined it either, until the day it became my reality. My name is on the plaintiff's list of a lawsuit that reads like something out of a twisted legal drama. Except this isn't fiction, this isn't entertainment, this is my life. And those two people staring at me with cold, determined eyes are my mother and father. The fluorescent lights in that courtroom felt like they were burning into my skull. The wooden benches creaked with every nervous movement, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard, I thought everyone in that room could hear it. My hands were trembling, my mouth was dry, and I kept asking myself the same question over and over again. How did we get here? How did the people who taught me to ride a bike, who celebrated my birthdays, who held me when I cried, become the very people trying to destroy me in the most public and humiliating way possible? The answer to that question is complicated, painful, and filled with betrayal so deep that even now, months after everything that happened, I still wake up in the middle of the night struggling to believe it was real. But before I tell you about the moment in that courtroom that changed everything, before I reveal the one detail my attorney noticed that brought this nightmare to an end, I need to take you back to where it all began, to the moment when money turned my family into strangers, when greed poisoned the love that I thought was unbreakable, and when I learned the hardest lesson of my life, that blood doesn't always mean loyalty, and family doesn't always mean home. I grew up believing I had won the family lottery. My childhood was the kind you see in old photographs that people frame and put on their walls, the kind that looks perfect from every angle. My parents, Robert and Diana, seemed to have it all figured out. We lived in a comfortable suburban house with a white picket fence, literally, and a golden retriever named Buddy who would greet me every day after school. My father worked as a regional manager for a manufacturing company, and my mother was a part-time nurse who made the best chocolate chip cookies in the neighborhood. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we were comfortable, stable, and most importantly, or so I thought, we were happy. Every Sunday we would have family dinner at my grandmother's house, my father's mother, a woman named Eleanor, who was the matriarch of our family in every sense of the word. Grandma Eleanor was one of those rare people who seemed to radiate warmth and wisdom in equal measure. She had built a successful career as a real estate investor back when women in business were a rarity, and she had accumulated considerable wealth over the decades. But despite her financial success, she never flaunted it, never made anyone feel less than, never let money define who she was as a person. She lived modestly in the same house she had bought 50 years earlier, drove the same car for almost 20 years, and found more joy in her garden than in any luxury item she could have afforded. I was her only grandchild, and we had a special bond that went beyond the typical grandparent-grandchild relationship. She would tell me stories about her life, about the challenges she faced, about the lessons she learned, and she always emphasized the importance of integrity, kindness, and independence. She would say to me, "Sweetheart, money can disappear in an instant, but who you are as a person, that's forever." Those words would come back to haunt me in ways I never could have anticipated. Growing up, I never noticed anything wrong with my parents' relationship with money. They seemed responsible, hardworking, and content with what they had. My father would sometimes complain about his job, wishing he could retire early, and my mother would occasionally mention how nice it would be to travel more, but these seemed like normal adult concerns, nothing that suggested the darkness that was lurking beneath the surface. Everything changed when I turned 28. I had built a decent life for myself by that point. I had graduated from college with a degree in graphic design, worked my way up in a small but growing marketing agency, and had just gotten engaged to my longtime girlfriend Sarah, who was a teacher at a local elementary school. We were planning our wedding, looking at apartments we could afford, and dreaming about the future like any young couple in love. Life felt like it was finally coming together, like all the hard work and sacrifices were paying off. Then, on a rainy Tuesday evening in October, I received a phone call that would set in motion a chain of events that would tear my family apart. It was my grandmother's attorney, a man named Richard Chen, calling to inform me that Grandma Eleanor had passed away peacefully in her sleep the night before. The news hit me like a physical blow. I had just seen her 3 days earlier, and she had seemed fine, maybe a little more tired than usual, but nothing that suggested she was in any immediate danger. We had sat in her garden, drinking tea and talking about my upcoming wedding, and she had held my hand and told me how proud she was of the man I had become. That was the last conversation we ever had, and I'm grateful for every moment of it, even though the pain of losing her felt unbearable. The funeral was a blur of tears, condolences, and memories shared by people whose lives she had touched. My parents seemed genuinely devastated, my father especially, as he had lost his mother, and I took some comfort in the fact that we were all grieving together, supporting each other through this profound loss. About a week after the funeral, my family was called to Mr. Chen's office for the reading of my grandmother's will. This is where everything started to unravel in ways I never could have imagined. The attorney's office was one of those traditional spaces with dark wood paneling, leather chairs, and rows of legal books that probably hadn't been touched in decades. My parents and I sat across from Mr. Chen's desk, and I remember my father nervously tapping his foot while my mother kept checking her phone, which I thought was odd given the solemnity of the occasion. Mr. Chen opened the will and began reading in that formal legal tone that attorneys use, full of whereases and party of the first parts. The first few items were fairly standard: some jewelry to a longtime friend, a donation to a charity she had supported for years, her house to be sold with proceeds split between various causes. Then came the part that changed everything. Mr. Chen looked up from the document, made direct eye contact with me, and said that my grandmother was leaving the bulk of her estate, approximately $2.4 million, directly to me, her grandson, with very specific instructions. The money was to be held in a trust until I turned 30, at which point I would have full access to it, with the explicit stipulation that it was to be used for my education, my future, my dreams, and most importantly, it could not be accessed, borrowed against, or influenced by anyone else, including my parents. The room went completely silent. I was in shock, not because of the money itself, but because I had no idea my grandmother had that kind of wealth, and I certainly never expected to inherit anything beyond maybe some personal mementos. My father's face went from surprise to red to something I had never seen before, something that looked almost like rage. My mother's eyes went wide, and she immediately started asking Mr. Chen questions about whether the will could be contested, whether there had been any mistake, whether my grandmother had been of sound mind when she made these decisions. The attorney calmly explained that the will had been updated just 6 months earlier, that Grandma Eleanor had been thoroughly evaluated by medical professionals to confirm her mental competency, and that her wishes were crystal clear and legally binding. He then shared something that felt like a knife to my heart. My grandmother had left a personal letter for my parents, which Mr. Chen handed to my father. I watched as my dad opened it with shaking hands and read it silently, his jaw clenching tighter with every passing second. He didn't share what it said. Not then, not ever, but I later learned from Mr. Chen, after everything fell apart, that Grandma Eleanor had written to explain her decision, expressing her concern that my parents had developed an unhealthy relationship with money, that she had observed behaviors that worried her, and that she wanted to ensure I had the independence and security to build my own life without financial pressure or manipulation. She loved my parents, the letter said, but she loved me enough to protect me from what she feared they might become. The drive home from that attorney's office was the most uncomfortable 20 minutes of my life. Nobody spoke. The air in the car felt thick with tension, anger, and hurt. I tried to break the silence several times, saying things like, "We should talk about this," or "I never expected this," or "We're still family," but my attempts at conversation were met with cold silence. When we got to my parents' house, my father finally exploded. He started yelling about how ungrateful my grandmother had been, how he had sacrificed everything for her over the years, how he had been there for her when nobody else was, and how this will was a slap in the face to everything he had done. My mother joined in, crying and saying how betrayed she felt, how they had counted on that inheritance to retire, to travel, to finally live the life they deserved. I was stunned by this response. First of all, I hadn't known they were counting on any inheritance, that they were planning their lives around money that wasn't even theirs yet. Second, and more importantly, they weren't talking about their grief over losing Grandma Eleanor. They weren't sharing memories or expressing sadness over her death. They were only focused on the money, on what they felt they had been denied, on what they believed they were owed. I tried to reason with them, suggesting that maybe we could work something out, that I could help them financially once I had access to the trust. But this only seemed to make things worse. My father looked at me with an expression of pure contempt and said something I will never forget. "You turned her against us, didn't you? You manipulated an old woman to steal our inheritance." I was so shocked I couldn't even respond. The accusation was so absurd, so cruel, so completely disconnected from reality, that I just stood there with my mouth open, unable to form words. My mother added that I had always been her favorite, that I had always gotten special treatment, and that this was just the ultimate example of how I had been chosen over them. Nothing I said could penetrate their anger. Nothing I did could calm them down, and eventually I just left, walking out of that house with tears streaming down my face, feeling like I had lost not just my grandmother, but my entire family in the span of a few days. The following months were a nightmare of deteriorating relationships and increasingly bizarre behavior from my parents. At first, they tried the guilt approach, calling me constantly to talk about their financial struggles, their medical bills that they couldn't afford, their car that was breaking down, their retirement plans that were falling apart. Every conversation was designed to make me feel responsible for their problems, to pressure me into giving them access to money that was legally mine, but that I couldn't even access for another 2 years. I tried to help in small ways, offering to pay for specific bills or sending them money when I could from my own salary, but nothing was ever enough. They wanted guarantees. They wanted promises. They wanted me to sign documents that would give them power of attorney over the trust, which of course I refused to do because the whole point of my grandmother's will was to prevent exactly that kind of situation. Then they switched tactics and started spreading lies about me to extended family members, telling cousins and aunts and uncles that I had manipulated Grandma Eleanor, that I had isolated her from them, that I was a greedy and ungrateful son who had turned against his own parents. Family members who had known me my entire life suddenly started treating me differently, some confronting me at family gatherings, others just avoiding me altogether. The worst part was that some people actually believed the lies, which showed me how easily family bonds could be poisoned by jealousy and greed. My relationship with Sarah became strained because she couldn't understand how parents could treat their child this way, and honestly, neither could I. We postponed our wedding because I couldn't imagine celebrating love and commitment while my family was in such chaos. I started seeing a therapist to deal with the anxiety, depression, and guilt that were consuming me, and slowly, with professional help, I began to understand that I wasn't responsible for my parents' feelings, that I hadn't done anything wrong by accepting an inheritance that my grandmother specifically wanted me to have, and that sometimes people show you who they really are when money enters the equation. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, just when I had started to build some emotional distance and learn to accept that my relationship with my parents might never be the same, I came home from work one evening to find a thick manila envelope taped to my apartment door. My hands were full of groceries. I was tired from a long day, and I almost didn't notice it, but something about the official-looking envelope caught my attention. I set down my groceries, opened the door, brought everything inside, and then sat down at my kitchen table to open this mysterious envelope. Inside were legal documents, lots of them, with the kind of language that makes your eyes glaze over if you're not a lawyer. But certain words jumped out at me as I scanned the pages: plaintiff, defendant, lawsuit, financial elder abuse, undue influence, mental incompetence, fraud, and then I saw the names Robert Mitchell and Diana Mitchell versus Jonathan Mitchell. My parents were suing me. My own parents had filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that I had manipulated my grandmother into changing her will, that I had exercised undue influence over a mentally incompetent person, that I had committed fraud and elder abuse, and that the will should be invalidated with the estate distributed according to what they claimed were my grandmother's original wishes, which conveniently would have left everything to them. I read the documents 3 times, hoping that somehow I was misunderstanding, that this was some kind of mistake. But there was no mistake. This was real. This was happening. And according to the court date listed on the summons, I had 30 days to respond, and this case was going to trial. I don't remember much about that evening except that I called Sarah, and she came over immediately, finding me sitting on my kitchen floor surrounded by legal papers, crying so hard I could barely breathe. How does a person process the fact that their parents hate them enough to destroy them publicly in court? How do you reconcile the people who raised you with the people who would accuse you of elder abuse and fraud? I felt like my entire childhood had been a lie. Like every I love you and every hug and every family dinner had been conditional, dependent on me staying in line, on me not having anything they wanted, on me remaining small enough that I didn't threaten their expectations or their plans. The next morning, with Sarah's encouragement and support, I called the attorney my grandmother had used, Mr. Chen, to ask for his recommendation on who could represent me in this lawsuit. He gave me the name of Margaret Sullivan, a family law attorney who specialized in estate disputes and who had a reputation for being brilliant, tough, and uncompromising when it came to defending her clients. I met with Margaret 3 days later in her downtown office, and from the moment I started explaining my situation, I could see her expression shift from professional interest to genuine outrage on my behalf. She listened to everything, asked detailed questions about my relationship with my grandmother, about the circumstances surrounding the will, about my parents' behavior since the inheritance, and about the specific allegations they were making in the lawsuit. When I finished talking, Margaret leaned back in her chair, steepled her fingers, and said something that gave me my first glimmer of hope in months. "Your parents have made a serious mistake by filing this lawsuit, and I'm going to prove it." She explained that claims of undue influence and mental incompetence required substantial evidence, that my grandmother's attorney had already documented her mental competency, and that my parents would have to prove not just that they disagreed with the will, but that I had actively manipulated or coerced my grandmother into changing it. Margaret requested all of my grandmother's medical records, copies of all previous versions of her will, phone records, emails, anything that could establish a timeline of events and demonstrate the true nature of my relationship with Grandma Eleanor. What we discovered during this investigation process was both heartbreaking and illuminating. It turned out that my grandmother had been updating her will gradually over the course of 5 years, not all at once, and that each version showed a progressive shift away from leaving money to my parents and toward protecting my future. Margaret also uncovered emails between my grandmother and Mr. Chen where she explicitly expressed her concerns about my parents' gambling habits, yes, gambling habits that I had known nothing about, their mounting credit card debt, and their increasingly frequent requests for her to loan them money. My grandmother had been watching, documenting, and quietly protecting me from a situation that I didn't even know existed. Have you ever discovered that someone loved you so much they were shielding you from truths you weren't ready to handle? That's what my grandmother had done, and it made her loss even more painful, because I realized I would never get to thank her for her wisdom and foresight. As we prepared for trial, Margaret conducted depositions with my parents, and I had to sit in a room and watch them lie under oath about our family history, about my relationship with my grandmother, about conversations that never happened and events that were completely fabricated. My father claimed that I had systematically isolated Grandma Eleanor from them, preventing them from visiting, screening her phone calls, and poisoning her mind against them. My mother cried on cue, playing the victim, talking about how much she loved her mother-in-law and how devastated she was to be cut out of her life by a manipulative grandson. It would have been almost theatrical if it weren't so personally destructive. Margaret methodically dismantled each of their claims with evidence. Phone records showing that my grandmother had regularly called them, and they often didn't answer. Testimony from neighbors who confirmed that my parents rarely visited. Financial records showing that they had repeatedly asked her for money, and perhaps most damning, emails from my grandmother to her attorney, explicitly stating that she was making these decisions of her own free will because she was worried about my parents. Financial irresponsibility. But my parents weren't backing down. They had clearly decided that this was their hill to die on, that they would either get this money or destroy me trying. And as the trial date approached, I felt like I was living in a constant state of dread and anxiety. I couldn't sleep, I was losing weight, my work was suffering, and Sarah, bless her heart, was holding me together with patience and love that I didn't feel I deserved. The night before the trial, I sat in my apartment and wrote a letter to my parents that I never sent, pouring out all my feelings of betrayal, hurt, and grief. I wrote about the father who taught me to throw a baseball and the mother who sang me to sleep, and I asked them on paper how those people could become the ones sitting across from me in a courtroom, ready to destroy their own son for money. I never sent that letter, but writing it helped me process the reality that the parents I had loved were gone, replaced by people I didn't recognize, and that no matter what happened in court, our relationship would never be the same. Comment below if you've ever had to accept that someone you loved wasn't who you thought they were, because that realization is one of the hardest parts of growing up. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in February, almost a year after my grandmother's death. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, more intimate, which somehow made everything feel worse. There's something about sitting just 20 feet away from your parents in a formal legal setting that makes the whole situation feel surreal, like you're watching your life play out as a dark drama that you have no control over. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, an aggressive-looking man named Harold Brennan, who had a reputation for taking questionable cases if the money was right. I sat at the defense table with Margaret, who was calm, prepared, and radiating the kind of quiet confidence that made me believe, for the first time in months, that maybe this nightmare would end in my favor. The judge, a woman named Justice Patricia Rowland, entered the courtroom, and we all stood in that ritualistic show of respect that courts require. She was probably in her early 60s, with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she had seen every kind of family drama imaginable and wasn't impressed by any of it. The trial began with opening statements, and listening to Harold Brennan describe me as a manipulative predator who had taken advantage of an elderly woman's vulnerability made me feel physically ill. He painted a picture of a scheming grandson who had systematically isolated his grandmother, who had whispered lies about his parents to turn her against them, who had exploited her trust to steal millions of dollars that rightfully belonged to his hardworking parents. It was a complete fiction, but he delivered it with such conviction that I found myself wondering if the judge might actually believe it. Then Margaret stood up for her opening statement, and everything changed. She spoke calmly but forcefully about the evidence we would present, about the documented timeline of my grandmother's decisions, about the medical evaluations confirming her mental competency, about the pattern of financial irresponsibility that had motivated my grandmother's protective actions. Margaret made it clear that this wasn't a case about a disputed inheritance. It was a case about two parents who were willing to destroy their son rather than accept responsibility for their own choices and financial failures. The first few days of trial were brutal. My parents took the stand and testified about what loving, devoted children they had been to my grandmother, how close their relationship had been, how shocked they were by the will. They cried. They expressed hurt. They played their parts perfectly for the judge. Their attorney presented cherry-picked examples of times when I had been at my grandmother's house, implying without evidence that these visits were opportunities for manipulation rather than what they actually were, a grandson spending time with someone he loved. Then it was our turn to present evidence, and Margaret was methodical, thorough, and devastating in her presentation. She called Mr. Chen to testify about his conversations with my grandmother, about her explicit concerns regarding my parents, about the steps he had taken to ensure she was of sound mind when making her decisions. She presented email after email, where my grandmother had articulated her reasoning, her values, and her desires for my future. She showed phone records proving that my parents had been the ones avoiding contact, not the other way around. She brought in one of my grandmother's doctors who testified that just 2 months before her death, he had evaluated her cognitive function and found her to be sharp, articulate, and completely capable of making complex decisions. But the most powerful moment came when Margaret called me to the stand. I was terrified. My hands were shaking, and I felt like I might throw up. But Margaret had prepared me well. She asked me to describe my relationship with my grandmother, and I spoke from the heart about our Sunday dinners, our conversations in her garden, the lessons she taught me, the genuine love and respect we had for each other. I explained that I had never asked her for money, that I had been as shocked as anyone by the inheritance, and that my only goal in accepting it was to honor her wishes and use it the way she had intended, to build a stable, independent life. Then came the cross-examination, where Harold Brennan tried to rattle me, to get me to admit to things I hadn't done, to paint me as the villain in this story. He asked aggressive questions about why I thought I deserved millions of dollars, why I wasn't willing to share with my parents whether I felt any guilt about their financial struggles. Margaret had coached me to stay calm, to answer honestly, and to not take the bait, and somehow I managed to do exactly that. Then came the moment that changed everything, the detail that my attorney had noticed and had been waiting for the perfect time to reveal. During her testimony, my mother had made a specific claim about a conversation she alleged happened between her and my grandmother, a conversation where my grandmother had supposedly told her that she was planning to leave everything equally to my father and to me, a conversation that my mother claimed happened just 3 months before the will was changed. It was a small detail in a sea of accusations, But Margaret had caught it and she had done her homework. On the final day of trial, Margaret recalled my mother to the stand and asked her to confirm the exact date of this alleged conversation. My mother, confident and composed, stated that it had happened on June 15th at my grandmother's house during an afternoon visit. Margaret nodded, thanked her, and then presented evidence that on June 15th my grandmother had been in the hospital for 3 days, following a minor surgical procedure, a fact confirmed by hospital records that were part of the discovery materials. My mother's face went pale. She started backtracking, saying maybe she had the date wrong, maybe it was a different day, but the damage was done. Margaret then systematically went through other specific claims my parents had made, cross-referencing them with phone records, calendar entries, and witness statements, and one by one, she proved that they were lying. The alleged isolation of my grandmother? Phone records showed she had called them 53 times in the last year of her life, and they had answered only 8 of those calls. The claims that I had prevented visits? Testimony from my grandmother's neighbors placed my parents at her house only twice in 2 years, while I had been there almost weekly. The assertion that my grandmother wasn't mentally competent? Medical records and testimony from 3 different doctors confirmed she had been evaluated and found completely sound. Justice Rowland's expression shifted from neutral to increasingly skeptical as Margaret presented each piece of evidence, each contradiction, each proven lie. The judge asked my parents directly whether they wanted to revise any of their testimony, giving them a chance to come clean, but my father stubbornly insisted they were telling the truth, and my mother just sat there crying, which was her go-to strategy whenever she was cornered. In her closing argument, Margaret delivered what I can only describe as a masterclass in legal advocacy. She spoke about the sanctity of a person's right to distribute their assets as they see fit, about the importance of respecting the wishes of the deceased, and about the tragedy of parents who would perjure themselves in court rather than accept their own responsibility for the situation they found themselves in. She pointed out that this entire lawsuit had never been about justice or truth. It had been about money, pure and simple, and that my parents had been willing to destroy their relationship with their son, to lie under oath, and to disgrace themselves publicly in pursuit of money that had never been theirs to begin with. She asked the judge to dismiss the case with prejudice, to award attorney's fees to me for having to defend against this frivolous lawsuit, and to send a clear message that attempts to manipulate the legal system to overturn valid wills would not be tolerated. Then Harold Brennan gave his closing argument, which was weak, defensive, and increasingly desperate as he tried to explain away all the inconsistencies and lies that had been exposed during the trial. He claimed that my parents were just grieving people who had made honest mistakes about dates and details, that their pain over losing access to money they had expected was understandable, and that the court should show compassion for their situation. It was a pathetic ending to a pathetic case, and I could see from Justice Rowland's expression that she wasn't buying any of it. The judge said she would take the matter under advisement and would issue a ruling within 2 weeks. Walking out of that courthouse after the final day of trial was one of the strangest experiences of my life. I felt exhausted, emotionally drained, but also strangely lighter, like a weight I had been carrying for a year was finally starting to lift. My parents left through a different exit, avoiding any contact with me, which was fine because I had nothing to say to them anymore. Margaret put her hand on my shoulder and told me to go home, try to rest and wait for the judge's decision, which she was confident would be in my favor. 12 days later, I received a call from Margaret telling me that Justice Rowland had issued her ruling. We arranged to meet at her office so she could walk me through the decision. When I arrived, Margaret had a copy of the 42-page ruling on her desk, and she was smiling. The judge had ruled completely in my favor, finding that my parents had failed to provide any credible evidence of undue influence, that my grandmother's will was valid and should be enforced exactly as written, that the medical evidence clearly established her mental competency, and most significantly that my parents had engaged in perjury and had filed a frivolous lawsuit in bad faith. Justice Rowland wrote in her decision, and I'm quoting directly here, that the court finds the testimony of the plaintiffs to be contradictory, unsupported by evidence, and in several instances, demonstrably false. She went on to state that it is a tragedy when parents allow financial disappointment to poison their relationship with their child, and that the deceased grandmother in this case showed remarkable wisdom and foresight in structuring her estate to protect her grandson from exactly the kind of manipulation and pressure that this lawsuit represents. The judge ordered my parents to pay my attorney's fees, which totaled over $80,000, and issued sanctions against them and their attorney for bringing a frivolous case to court. Reading that decision was cathartic in a way I can't fully describe. It wasn't just about winning, although obviously that mattered. It was about being vindicated, about having an objective third party look at all the evidence and confirm what I had known all along, that I had done nothing wrong, that my grandmother's decisions were her own, and that my parents' accusations were lies motivated by greed and entitlement. I called Sarah immediately, and she came to Margaret's office where we cried together. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief, of gratitude, of finally being able to close this horrible chapter. That evening I wrote a letter to my grandmother, even though she was gone, thanking her for her wisdom, for protecting me, for knowing me well enough to understand that I would need that protection. I told her that I would use her gift wisely, that I would live with integrity the way she had taught me, and that I would never forget the lessons she had tried to impart about what really matters in life. The aftermath of the trial was complicated. My parents, faced with the reality of owing $80,000 in legal fees on top of their existing debts, filed for bankruptcy. I heard this through extended family members, not from them directly, because they never contacted me after the ruling. They never apologized, never tried to make amends, never acknowledged what they had put me through. Some family members reached out to me after the trial, apologizing for believing the lies they had been told and expressing their support. A few others cut contact with me entirely, either because they believed I had somehow orchestrated the whole thing or because they felt I should have just given my parents the money to avoid all the drama, completely missing the point that the drama wasn't my creation, it was theirs. Sarah and I eventually got married in a small ceremony with close friends and the family members who had stood by me throughout this ordeal. It wasn't the big wedding we had originally planned, but it was perfect in its own way, intimate and genuine and focused on the people who actually mattered. We used part of the trust money, once I finally had access to it at 30, to buy a house, to pay off Sarah's student loans, and to start a college fund for the children we hope to have someday. I also set up a scholarship fund in my grandmother's name for students pursuing careers in healthcare or social work, fields she had cared deeply about, and knowing that her legacy would help other people achieve their dreams gave me a sense of purpose and peace. The rest of the money sits in investments, earning returns, providing security, and serving exactly the purpose my grandmother intended, giving me the freedom to make choices based on what's right rather than what's financially necessary. I still think about my parents sometimes, wondering if they ever feel regret, if they ever look back on what they destroyed for money they never even got. I wonder if they realize that if they had simply been happy for me, if they had accepted my grandmother's decision with grace, we could still have a relationship. I would have helped them voluntarily over the years, and they wouldn't be facing bankruptcy and estrangement from their only child. But those are questions I'll probably never have answers to, because we haven't spoken since the trial ended, and honestly, I'm not sure we ever will. What I've learned from this nightmare is that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by behavior, by choice, by the actions people take when tested by difficult circumstances. My grandmother was family in the truest sense, protecting me even after she was gone. Sarah is family, standing by me when everything was falling apart. Margaret became like family, fighting for me with passion and skill that went beyond just doing her job. And my parents, the people who were supposed to be my family by every definition, proved that biology alone isn't enough when love is conditional on getting what you want. I've also learned that money reveals character. It doesn't create it. My parents didn't become greedy because of the inheritance. The inheritance just exposed the greed that was already there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right trigger to emerge. I feel profound gratitude for my grandmother's wisdom in seeing what I couldn't see, in protecting me from people I thought I could trust, and in giving me not just financial security, but a clear example of what integrity looks like even when it costs you something, even when it means making unpopular decisions, even when it means acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the people you love. This experience has changed me fundamentally. I'm more cautious about trust, more aware of people's motivations, more protective of my boundaries. But I've also become more appreciative of genuine relationships, more committed to living according to my values, and more determined to be the kind of person my grandmother believed I could be. I look at my life now, the home Sarah and I have built, the stability we enjoy, the future we're planning, and I understand what my grandmother was trying to give me, Not just money, but freedom, choice, and the ability to build a life that reflects who I really am rather than what others expect me to be. That's the real inheritance, the one that matters, the one that can't be taken away in a courtroom or destroyed by family drama. Now I want to hear from you, because I know I can't be the only person who has experienced betrayal by people they thought they could trust. Have you ever had a family member turn on you over money? Have you been in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for what was right? Have you learned painful lessons about who people really are when money enters the equation? Share your stories in the comments below, because one of the things that helped me survive this experience was realizing that I wasn't alone. That family betrayal over inheritances and money is sadly more common than anyone wants to admit. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own experiences or taught you something about the importance of protecting yourself and honoring the wishes of people who love you, please hit that like button. It really does help this channel reach more people who might need to hear these stories, who might be going through their own versions of family drama, and need to know that they're not crazy, they're not wrong, and they deserve to have their boundaries respected. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real experiences from real people navigating the complicated, messy, painful, and sometimes beautiful reality of family relationships, money troubles, legal battles, and personal growth, please subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. This channel exists to share authentic stories that don't shy away from difficult truths, that acknowledge the complexity of human relationships, and that remind us all that we're not alone in our struggles. Thank you for listening to my story, for being part of this community, and for taking the time to engage with content that matters. Your support, your comments, your willingness to share your own experiences, all of it creates a space where people can be honest about the hard parts of life without judgment or shame. Until the next story, take care of yourselves, protect your peace, honor the people who truly love you, and remember that sometimes the family you choose is more important than the family you're born into.